Dune, Dune, Dune. It seems like it's all anyone can talk about these days, so I thought I'd throw my hat into the ring and give you guys a review on the novel and the movies. Let's start with the novel first. So many years ago, before the movie had even come out, I actually tried reading Dune. But the perspective shifts were just really jarring to me, and I really couldn't connect with Paul. But now that I have a little bit more reading experience under my belt, I thought I would give it another shot. And I revisited the books with a new perspective, and I actually found it fascinating. The third-person omniscient POV is definitely not for everyone, and it can really take a minute to get used to. But once it clicks, it just makes sense. While you're reading this book, you're going to get the thoughts of every main character in the room. You're going to get the entire scope of the scene in a way you really don't get in other books. Usually in other books with limited third person, the author is going to go back in another chapter and rehash the same exact scene that you just saw, but through the eyes of another character. And I just find that to be extremely exhausting. But in this, that's not the case. Frank Herbert manages to handle it masterfully. And it never really feels like he ruins the pacing because he's getting someone else's thoughts. It doesn't feel like he ever just stops a scene. It's more like he's just hopping from one head to another while the events of the scene are unfolding. Now, another thing that Frank Herbert does extremely well in this book is the world building. The world building in this is absolutely top tier. You truly feel like this world is fleshed out and lived in. From the Space Guild and the Bene Gesserit, to the various houses, all the way down to the ecology of Arrakis, which is the desert planet in which the events of the book unfold on. The Fremen, which are the inhabitants of Arrakis, feel like a real group of people. They have their own language, culture, ways of surviving on Arrakis, and a deep, complex history. They feel real. Now, I would say that this book is more hard sci-fi than soft sci-fi, but some things still are left up to your imagination, just like the magic of the voice and its control over people. And I could definitely see the inspiration that Star Wars took from it with the Force. I never quite felt like I was reading a scientific paper, but I was impressed with the level of detail that Frank put into this world. Frank Herbert was an ecologist in real life, so it made sense that he tried to make his fictional sci-fi world as real and accurate as possible. On that same note, Frank is not going to hold your hand through any of this book. From the very first page, you're thrown into the world with little idea of who is who and what's going on. Now, you can go back and forth with the terms and definitions in the back, but I would recommend that you just read it and learn as you go. Things will become more clear as you read through it. The repetition of certain words start to make sense, and by the end of it, you should understand pretty much everything, but nothing is ever overtly explained with big info dumps or too much exposition. I personally like hand-holding world building and exposition if it's done well, but just know you're not going to find that in Dune. Although it is complex and dense, I didn't find it too difficult to read or understand, which is actually surprising. Frank Herbert writes in a very clear way, which was really refreshing to me. I was expecting to have difficulty with this, especially with it being such a dense sci-fi book, but I felt that after the first 50 pages or so, things really started to click. I got into a rhythm and I understood who Frank Herbert was as a writer and his writing style, and from that point on, I started to follow pretty easily until the end of the book. As for the story, this one is incredibly unique. I want this first part to be spoiler-free, so I'm not going to sit here and try and summarize it, but hell, I don't even think I could do it justice. Now, if you're looking for a straightforward hero's journey quest with a happy ending, you may want to look elsewhere. I never felt like the story meandered too far off the path, and it always felt like Frank had a clear vision of where he wanted to go and where it was going to end up. But I will say that it does move quite slow, and Frank really enjoys taking his time telling this story. As for the characters, Paul is an incredible protagonist. You don't know whether to root for him or to hate him, but you're always interested in what he has to say or what he is going to do no matter what. And if you don't really care for him at the beginning, give it time. That's kind of the point of the story. And I hate to say that, but it is true. He really grows into his own throughout it, and he ultimately becomes a complex, strong, flawed protagonist who you really want to follow by the end of it. Lady Jessica is similar in her own right. She's incredibly smart, fleshed out, feels like a mother to Paul, and pretty interesting to follow and watch. Her Bene Gesserit training from her past is present throughout the book, and you truly feel like she was trained for anything and everything that could come her way. She teaches Paul some great lessons and some not so great things. And the villain of this story, Baron Harkonnen, also changes by the end. To me, he started off a bit mustache twirling with some humor at the beginning, which I wasn't really a big fan of, but by the end he becomes more serious and formidable. All the supporting characters feel distinct and real, which is really surprising for how many there are. And I will say that these are some of the smartest and well-written characters I have ever come across in fiction, and the dialogue in this book is absolutely top tier. And that's honestly the best way I can describe this book. It's just smart. The writing, the world, the characters are crafted with such passion and care, and it really shows in this book. I believe Frank Herbert is a genius. Another really cool thing about this book is that at the top of every chapter, you're going to find little excerpts from fictional books within the Dune universe, and I actually found a lot of thought-provoking quotes within them. And reading them reminded me of reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Now, it might sound like I absolutely love this book, but in all honesty, I wouldn't say that it's my favorite, and I also wouldn't recommend that you just go read it right now. I can say that I 100% appreciate what this book is, who Frank Herbert is as a writer, and the story that it tells. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of political meddling type books, so it was kind of hard for me to get through this one. Much of this book is spent discussing future events rather than seeing them happen. Now, if you love that kind of thing, I think you'll absolutely love this book. But if you're a fan of more visceral, boots on the ground, blow-by-blow kind of action, I don't think this one's going to be for you. I felt like a lot of the conversations were too long-winded for my liking, and when the action scenes that I was expecting from the movies came, it felt like they were just kind of glossed over. In fact, I would sometimes be reading this book and not realize that something really big or important happened, because Frank's not going to stop the story to tell you that someone died, that something happened. He's just going to kind of continue going, and you might just get a sentence here or there. But I thought that the story would just come to a full halt and then you'd take some time for a character's death, but that's not really in this book. He just kind of says what happens and then carries on. Now, there are some cool fight scenes, and his description in them is actually really good. But overall, I just felt like the action was lacking in this book. And if you're a fan of lots of action in your sci-fi and fantasy books like I am, I think you might find that it just doesn't really have enough. He also has a flatter style of prose, which isn't super expressive and impactful action moments. And I found the pacing of this book to be very slow. Sometimes I didn't always look forward to reading it because it felt like a chore to sit down and get through it. Again, if you like heavy political stories, you are going to absolutely adore this book. I think it'll be hard to come across anything that's better than this in the sci-fi world, and you're just going to absolutely love it. If not, then you might want to pass on it and watch the movies instead to kind of get the main gist of the story. And before we start talking about the movies, I just want to finish this section on a more positive note by telling you guys some of my favorite scenes from the book. The Harkonnen attack at the beginning of the book really kicks the story into overdrive. And it was the first time I really sat forward in my seat with excitement while reading this book. I love the discussion with Paul and his mother in the still tent, and I'm an absolute sucker for those type of deep philosophical discussions after reading the Dark Tower series. That entire sequence while Paul is learning his history while also beginning to see the future realities in front of him is just absolutely incredible. The Thopter flight through the storm was very visceral and fun to read. Of course, the riding of the sandworm is a highlight of the book and just such a unique and badass world building element. And finally, the fight at the end with Paul and Fade with their shields down was gripping and intense. Overall, I thought that this book was incredible, even if it wasn't my type of book that I usually like to read. And I highly recommend that you get out of your comfort zone and read things that you usually might not. And I think that this is especially true if you're a writer, because it's going to help you become a more well-rounded one, while also showing you another author's style. Now for the movies. The movies are also incredible. I saw the first one at home, but then I went and saw the second one in IMAX, and I actually went and saw it twice because it was that good. It's been a really long time since I saw something that awe-inspiring, while leaving me thinking about the story for days to come after. The sound design in this film is some of the best I've ever heard. Anytime anyone used the voice or you saw an explosion, you truly felt it.
Consider what you're about to do, Paul Atreides.
Silence!
Cinematography is absolutely next level, and I'm going to throw some clips up now so that you can see some of my favorite scenes. While I was watching, I was just in awe of the practical effects used in this film, along with the top-notch CGI that never felt rubbery or cringeworthy and was just an absolute spectacle to witness. The on-location filming that they did for this film is a triumph on its own. Shooting for as long as they did in the sand is a monumental task, and I have to give major praise and credit to Denis Villeneuve because he absolutely knocked it out of the park with this film. He could have easily chosen the easier route and filmed all of his scenes on a soundstage and some backlot in LA, but it just feels so real while you're watching it, and I really have to thank him for going down the harder route. I think he is one of the greatest working directors today and will eventually go down in history as one of the greatest directors of all time. Now for the screenplay. Adapting Dune into a screenplay was no easy task, but I think they did their absolute best. They kept the greatest elements from the book while also making it more engaging and action-packed. They managed to make Shani more interesting and fleshed out while also giving her believable motives. Now, in my master's program, we are taught to look at films with a want and a need in mind. The want is usually a goal that the main character is trying to get, while the need is something emotional that another character is trying to wake them up to that will make them whole and elevate them to hero status. And with this concept, there are actually two antagonists. You have the want antagonist, the person who is standing in the way of the goal of the main protagonist, and then you have the need antagonist, the person who's trying to wake them up to their emotional need. To me, I thought that Paul's want in the first film is to carry on his family's legacy while also still being his own person. His emotional need, however, is acceptance. He needs to accept that there are greater things at play that involve him and will not be possible unless he steps into the role of the Messiah that his mother has laid out for him. And that makes the Harkonnens the want antagonists because they are the ones who are the biggest threat to House Atreides and stand in the way of Paul's want. And his need antagonist is his mother because she is the one trying to wake him up to his need of acceptance in becoming the Messiah. By the end of the film, he ultimately wakes up to his need and joins life with the Fremen, elevating him to hero status. Now in the second film, Paul wants to avenge his father by getting revenge on the Harkonnens. His need, however, is humility. He needs humility to not become the Messiah and use the Fremen for his own personal gain. Again, the Harkonnens are the want antagonists because they are the ones standing in the way of his revenge. But this time around, Shawnee is the need antagonist because she is the one trying to wake up Paul to his need of humility to not go through with becoming the Messiah. By the end of the film, he ultimately fails to wake up to his need and falls into tragedy, which is why Paul is a tragic figure in this film, even though he gets his want in the end. It was a monumental task attempting to adapt something like this into a screenplay because it's such a big story and it could barely even fit into two gigantic movies. I thought the pacing in the first movie was pretty rough, and it couldn't really be changed in order to tell the full story. I think the biggest problem with the first movie is that the climax happens at the end of the second act. And from there, you're still left with another hour of film, and nothing nearly as big or exciting happens after that point. For people who read the book, it was awesome to see those scenes in that last hour play out on the big screen, but for casual audiences, I could see how it could come across as boring. I think that first film has a really hard time standing on its own, and it really needs to be seen back to back with the second. The second film greatly improved on the pacing, and I haven't seen something that long move so quickly since Avengers Infinity War. A few moments from the movies that stood out to me were the attack on House Atreides, Jessica and Paul flying through the storm and the still tent scene, of course the riding the sandworm with the incredible music, the Harkonnen soldiers flying up the rocks, the attack on the spice harvesters, and finally the climax of the film with the launching of the family atomics, the desert power with the worms, the Fremen ground assault, and the Fade vs. Paul fight at the end. That entire sequence was absolutely jaw-dropping and mesmerizing to watch, and it is one of the greatest cinema experiences I've ever had in my entire life. Overall, I do not shy away from calling these films masterpieces. Finally, I will leave you with a few quotes from the book that really resonated with me. Humans live best when each has his own place, when each knows where he belongs in the scheme of things. Destroy the place and destroy the person. We came from Caladan, a paradise world for our form of life. There existed no need on Caladan to build a physical paradise or a paradise of the mind. We could see the actuality all around us, and the price we paid was the price men have always paid for achieving a paradise in this life. We went soft, we lost our edge. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. And finally, the mystery of life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to experience. I hope you enjoyed my review of Dune, and if you did, please drop a like and subscribe. These were some of my thoughts, feelings, and opinions on this incredible piece of art, and if you have any of your own, please drop them down in the comments below. As always, happy reading and writing, and I'll see you guys next time.